Today, in sort of a random, undirected way, I got reminded of one of life's simple pleasures that for me goes all the way back to childhood, and that is picking and eating and doing other things with various berries. And it came up in part because blueberries are one of my favorite kind of fruits. They have been since I was a kid, and I was recalling the joy that I had as a child in Indiana, where my relatives, my grandfather and grandmother, and great aunt and great uncle, and some of my other relatives, all retired to and lived near Rose Lawn, where there were growing wild some low bush blueberries. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So, as a kid, berries were something that typically you had one of two ways. So we're talking about in the 1970s and going into the 1980s. You couldn't get them in the store all the time because you generally didn't get things that were out of season unless you were, going to pay a lot of money for them to be shipped from somewhere. So there were seasons for strawberries and red raspberries and black raspberries, which grew wild, and blueberries and, whatever sort of other exotic things you might come across, like, cranberries or currants or stuff along those lines. And so there were, one of two ways you would typically get them. Either you went to the store or to a stand where somebody was selling them. It was kind of frequent for people who were farming things to set up, roadside stalls for berries, but also for like, squash and corn and things like that, or you would go and pick them yourself. And there was kind of a halfway middle ground where there were farms where you could go pick the stuff yourself, right? And we would do that sometimes for strawberries, but not for other things. And some of these would only grow in domesticated ways, and some of them would grow wild. So in Wisconsin, where I grew up, you could grow strawberries, you could grow blueberries, you could also grow red raspberries, but you wouldn't find them typically out in the woods or in other places. By the way, there were also a lot of other berries we were definitely not supposed to eat. And, we would be told they're poisonous, they could be bad for you. So honeysuckle was all over the place. It would make these beautiful either red or orange berries. There was always some dumb kid who was eating them and then getting sick. Dogwood had these very attractive, whitish, cream colored berries that some dumb kid would eat as well. But I always stayed away from those sorts of things. And what we had growing wild in our woods was black raspberries. That was like all over the place here in southern Wisconsin, so that was pretty cool. But we didn't have like blueberries growing wild or wild strawberries, except in, rare occasions you might find wild strawberries. I don't think I ever saw any in the area that I lived in. And you typically wouldn't see any of the other things that you can find, like gooseberries or stuff like that. So I remember the joy that I felt. So I would stay, and I've talked about this before, a lot of my summer months, I would stay out in Indiana with my grandpa and grandma and great aunt and great uncle, Therese and Hubert, and then when my aunt Bibian and Uncle Scott bought Uncle Ernie and Bernice's house with them. While my sister would typically go and stay with Uncle John and Aunt Mary in Chicago. And I think my mom did that in part because it's cool to spend time with your relatives, and the relatives like spending time with you, but also it like got us out of her and my dad's hair and gave, them some time to, have alone without kids, which, fine as well, because I had a great time out there. And so, anyway, I got to range at that time over miles and miles of fairly flat, sandy, but often wooded and sometimes marshy because that whole area used to be the Grand Kankakee Marsh terrain. And I loved it as a kid. I grew up in the countryside, so I was used to like ranging for miles and miles in whatever direction, either with a friend or by myself or with my dog. So I would do that anyway. And I discovered that there were two things growing in Indiana that we didn't have in Wisconsin. So blueberries come in two different varieties. There's the big ones, the large bush blueberries, which are the ones that you typically buy at the store. They're kind of big, they're really tasty. You can do a lot of stuff with them, make pies, use them in other desserts. I actually at one time brewed blueberry beer. But there's also what's called low bush blueberries, and they have smaller berries and they grow wild in certain places, particularly if you have sandy, kind of poor soil. That's what they like. Actually, all the blueberries do. So, northwestern Indiana is like heaven for blueberry plants. And I saw them growing, and I was there in the summer. So, I see them turning blue, and I'm like, are these blueberries? They're really little and they're low to the ground. So I go out there and I start picking them and eating them. And I'm like, holy crap, these are blueberries. And, my favorite fruit. So I go and I talk to my grandpa and grandma and Uncle Ebert and Aunt Teresa. And they're like, yeah, there's blueberries. Knock yourself out. Eat as many of them as you'd like. I mean, don't eat so much that you like totally get sick, but have as much as you'd like to. So I would go out and get like a bucket, and I think they viewed it as well. He's getting some exercise, and he's out of our hair for a while. So awesome, keeps him out of trouble. We know where he is, and I would just go around and pick them, and then come back. And sometimes we'd like have them in pancakes, or my aunt would make a pie, or we'd put them in pudding or stuff like that. But a lot of times I'd be eating them as I'm picking them as well. So that was one thing that was really cool. The other thing that was really, really cool, and this is less widespread, was that there were wild strawberries. And wild strawberries are real tiny, but they grow on the ground just like regular strawberries do. And they're so, so sweet, right? And they didn't grow, or they didn't ripen for more than like a week space there. And you had to get out there at the right time because the birds liked them as well, and the birds would eat them all up if you didn't get out there soon enough. But you'd pick them, and you never pick enough to have more than like maybe a cup. But oh, they were amazing, and I'd bring them back, and my uncle actually liked eating them too, so I'd share them with Uncle Hubert, and he'd be like, I can put them in my breakfast cereal. So that was pretty cool. I mentioned black raspberries. That's something that we would go out in the woods. They grew all over the place, and I would pick tons and tons and tons of them and, eat them while I was doing. Of course, they stain your fingers a lot in your mouth while you're doing it. And they've got a great taste. They also grew in Indiana, so I would pick them as well. I think I've talked about that in the past. And one of the really cool memories that I have was when I was in the Army. So I was stationed, as most Americans in Germany were, in the south of Germany. I was in Bavaria, near Fürstenwald, which is near the Czech border, and not that far from Nuremberg. So we'd often have to go out on marches and stuff like that, and we'd walk along these woods. And if we had some time on our hands, we'd kind of like explore around. Now, Bavaria is quite similar in climate and even in a lot of the local flora to Wisconsin, where I grew up. And lots and lots and lots of blackberries. And I remember actually taking off my Kevlar helmet and basically filling it up. I mean, we weren't supposed to do this at all. Me and another guy, we were picking berries, and just like filling it up with all the blackberries that I had. And of course, I couldn't put my helmet back on, so I'm wearing my ball cap at the time. And the sergeant like comes up to me, and I thought he was going to like give me a hard time, but he's like, "Oh, that's fine. Share them with the other guys. This is cool," and all of that. So that was kind of a fun memory. We tried our hand at growing strawberries. We were never really that successful, I think, because my mom and dad didn't understand all that well how to use the netting, which keeps the birds from coming in and eating them all up. And maybe they didn't care. So we would often go in the summer to these pick your own strawberry farms and get those. And then, you bring them home and you have them with all of these sorts of things: blueberries, black raspberries, as I'm going to talk about, red raspberries, strawberries. You would like put them in a bowl and pour some milk or cream over them and a little bit of sugar and stir it all around. And then you just eat it like that. Or you could put them into a milkshake, or you could sprinkle them over your breakfast cereal in the morning so that, Special K or Total or whatever brand you were eating wasn't quite so boring. So that was a common thing to do. The other thing that I'll bring up about this, so I mentioned red raspberries. So black raspberries are kind of little. Red raspberries are bigger. They're domesticated. They're less tart. They're more sweet, I would say, and there's less seed to fruit ratio. Let's just put it like that. So they're kind of softer, right? And I think a lot of people prefer red raspberries to black raspberries, which we always call blackberries, by the way. To the south, there were actual blackberries, which are a different kind of fruit, which have invaded Wisconsin now because of global warming. Anyway, we had a big garden, and alongside the garden, my dad planted all these canes of red raspberry. And he didn't get to see how big they got because he died, unfortunately, quite young. But, they branch out. And so what started out as just like a single row of canes became a pretty dense, not quite jungle, but, like a whole bed that went on for, I would say, like, 60, 70 feet. And it got to be wider and wider and wider. And it got to be so wide that, they have thorns on them. So you can't just like blunder into the raspberry stuff. You couldn't actually reach in and get all of the raspberries. So I took a pair of shears and I cut a path going all the way down so that you could, not just pick the raspberries that were on the outside, but get to the inside. And of course, I cut down a lot of the raspberry canes, but they were so widespread. I want to say it was like about 10 feet of like growth wide, pretty dense, that you weren't hurting for raspberries. So I cut that path and I would keep it trimmed. And basically we had like two different hedges of raspberries at that time. So we would like make tons and tons and tons. And we, with some of these things, the other way that you could get it when it was out of season is if you would can it or preserve it. So, we actually at my house and then also in Indiana made a lot of different preserves. There were raspberry preserves, blueberry preserves, strawberry preserves, grape, because Uncle Hubert used to grow grapes. There was quince, apple, all of this kind of stuff. So, like in the middle of winter, you could get a nice taste of blackberry or strawberry or whatever. You'd go down to the basement where all the cans or jars, really, canning jars of these preserves were, and you'd bring them up and, spread it on some bread or something like that. So the last thing that I'll tell you about this is that I would think I was in either middle school or early high school. I think it was middle school. We had so many red raspberries that we would like eat them for dessert night after night after night. And I really overindulged. I remember one night, we had so much on hand. I picked like, a couple gallons worth of raspberries that day. I just sat down and made bowl after bowl after bowl with cream and sugar of these red raspberries. And my mom was like, you probably shouldn't be eating so much of that. I think you're going to get sick. And I was like, they're just so damn good. I'm eating them, right? And of course, I did get sick. I probably ate like 2 quarts at a time. I mean, think about, so this is like a 12-year-old kid probably, but I had a really great appetite. I was sort of like a bottomless pit at the time. I had a high metabolism. I was super skinny, and I could just eat. So I'm just shoveling these things down, and it's really wonderful. And finally, I get to the point where I'm like totally full, and that was okay. And then about half an hour later, I'm in the bathroom throwing up, feeling awful, right? Because you can't eat too much of that kind of food. After that, I could pick them, but I didn't want to eat raspberries for about 2 years. It took that long for me to get over that experience of having made myself sick eating them. But then after that, I started I was like, I wonder if I can eat these again. And sure enough, I ate some and I was like, all right, back to business. Just not going to eat quite so much of those anymore. And so, that's my childhood and even early adulthood. I'll tell you one other story too. That was kind of cool. So in the college that I went to, Lakeland College, now Lakeland University, there was this massive woodland behind the college. And I don't think it was the property of the college. It might have been state ground or something like that. And it was, wooded. And I've talked about, the things that I used to run out there and do other things as well. So I'm kind of a woodsman. When I'm walking, I keep an eye and I see like what's growing and what's going to be providing food or fruit or whatever later on down the line. And I could see like, wow, this is a great place for black raspberries. And so in the summer, I would go out there. I'd have to spray some mosquito spray on me because the mosquitoes were pretty bad. And I would just like take a gallon bucket and I would go throughout the area and pick at least a gallon worth of black raspberries. Now, these are pretty small berries, so you can imagine how many of them it takes to fill up like an ice cream gallon bucket. And that's what I would do. And then I'd take them home and I'd have black raspberries for like a whole week because they keep pretty well in the refrigerator. And I'd get them for free because I knew where to look. So that's, I think, maybe kind of a cool story. Maybe some of you who grew up outside of cities or even in cities that have good spots where things grow wild can relate to this. Might be of interest to some of you. But I was jarred thinking about, as I was eating some blueberries, about, Indiana and the low bush blueberries and all the other berries that I've enjoyed over the course of my childhood and adolescence and early 20s in the course of my life.